Right, so it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Christian, and to the Vista people for inviting me. I don't usually say yes, but I do love Norway, and you do a lot of fantastic work. I've been following some of the other FME projects like NTrans and so forth, and I did have a temporary visiting professorship at Western Norway Research Institute in Sogndal, so I've actually been to other places beyond Oslo, which is very nice. Christian got to choose the presentation for today. And we've chosen kind of energy transition as a multidimensional challenge. And really, I'm going to talk about just two things in my 15 minutes. The first is, can we accelerate transitions? What are their definitions? What does the historical record say? What might be different now at this critical moment? And secondly, this notion of multidimensionality and interdisciplinarity. And I'm going to show you some graphs that are almost as complicated as Christian's no-trap graph of all the work packages, because I do think the energy transition is that much of a multidimensional challenge. And it's great to see a grant proposal diagram that tries to capture that complexity. So I wanted to start just quickly with how we define an energy transition. Aristotle, writing thousands of years ago, said those who control the definition control the debate. And for those of you who study transitions, you'll know there are a multitude of different definitions. It can be changes in supply, gas to coal, coal to nuclear, renewables, efficiency. It can be changing technologies that exploit or utilize energy services or prime movers, gas turbines, internal combustion engines, microwaves, mobile phones. It can also be changes in institutions, like the restructuring of electric utilities, or the sudden collapse of energy systems like Cuba. And its kind of reliance on the USSR. They had a massive shock in 1990 at the fall of the Soviet Union, where they had to completely transition their energy system, which had nothing to do with technology and everything to do with politics. And then we have those kind of in behavioral psychology or innovation studies to talk about diffusion curves, like Everett Rogers. Who are the early innovators? Who are the early adopters? Who are the laggards, and so forth? And I actually also think you can ask these different questions at any scale. At the scale of this beautiful building, at the scale of a city, at the scale of a country, at the scale of the European Union, or at the scale of the entire globe. And the historical record is quite depressing. This is from Charlie Wilson and Arnulf Grubler, who talk about historical transitions here in Europe, so very relevant. They've mapped out here two core transitions. The top one is the phase out of really traditional hydro energy and like biomass and wood to things like coal and the steam engine, Watt's steam engine. And the bottom one is the more modern phase-in of kind of modern energy fuels, oil, crude oil, natural gas, electricity. And you can see, I put the little red circle there, even though coal had so much technical advantage and even economic advantage. Roger Fouquet has done a wonderful history of energy transitions going back to like the year 1000. Coal was like 150 times more efficient, right, than wood or charcoal or some of the energy devices, whale oil, kerosene that it was replacing. And even it took 160 years just to diffuse across England. And the fastest diffusion, they have a spatial notion of transition, which goes from the core to the rim to the periphery. In this case, it's Europe. If you were to add China or Kuwait, it'd take even longer. But you can see the fastest transition is still 96 years it took back then. And even the more recent phase-in of modern energy services, the fastest transition is Portugal, 47 years. And I'm going to admit, that's older than I am. So it took this transition longer to happen than I've actually lived here on the planet. And this has convinced many, like the geographer Vaclav Smil, to say things like this: energy transitions have been and will continue to be prolonged affairs, especially in big nations, especially in nations with large energy consumption. And look at that, it makes it impossible, not difficult, not challenging, Christian, impossible to accelerate their progress, even if you use highly effective interventions like carbon taxes or feed-in tariffs. He goes on later to say that it's an intergenerational challenge. It is impossible to do it in one generation. So he's a very pessimist. And behind Smil, he's got these numbers, and this is the same data just plotted two ways, the timeline, and then if you add up the numbers, you get to the bottom one. He's looking at total primary energy supply across the world, so very macro scale. And you can see, again, even though coal had all of these advantages, it took it more than a century to reach 25% of total primary energy supply. Oil, even though it also was called liquid gold and is incredibly energy dense, took 80 years, natural gas about 90 years, and nuclear power hasn't even come close to the 25% mark, nor have any of the individual renewables. This is energy, not electricity. So hydropower is less than, it's like 22% of global electricity supply. But for energy, it's even lower. So wind, solar photovoltaics, nuclear power have not even come close to 25%. And then Arnoff teamed up with Greg Nemeth here and Charlie to look at kind of innovation of different artifacts. That's the term we like in science technology studies. And they studied a lot of artifacts. Steamships, bicycles, cars, combined cycle turbines, jet aircraft, electronic bikes, mobile phones, compact fluorescent light bulbs. And on the left, the formative phase is how long it took the innovators to actually design the technology. And then the diffusion phase is how long, once the technology was ready for market, it took to diffuse. So to get to the true transition time, you have to add up both diagrams. So steam engines, right, took almost 150 years through their kind of RD&D phase, and then you can see on the right, they took another 60 to 80 years to diffuse across the world. So it's not looking good. And this is just of individual, isolated artifacts. If you look at systems transitions, so not power plants, but grids, pipeline networks, LNG, harbor connections and things like that, it takes even longer. It's a magnitude of order longer to transition systems beyond individual technologies. Lastly, Bruno and Frank here have looked at what they call the opposite side. This is the flip side of an energy transition, which is an untransition or a phase out, or what they call regime destabilization. How do you destabilize an existing technology that you don't want? It's also a new term some of you may have heard. It's not innovation, it's exnovation, phasing out of innovations that are unwanted, like nuclear weapons or assault rifles or DDT or pesticides. And here we go. Even in the UK, this is how long it took them to phase out coal. And the two things that I'm struck with, one, those lines that are like a roller coaster, the term they like to use is punctuated equilibria, shows you it's not a linear process. There are fits and starts. And if you look at 1930, it looks like it's going up. 1948, it looks like it's going up. Even recently in the 80s after Thatcher, it looked like it was going up. So again, very hard to predict the directionality of the transitions. And secondly, as you can see, phases of coordinated destabilization, including very strong-arm measures like the Clean Air Act or the Climate Change Act that had to force coal into its phase-out. So again, if you're looking at how long it takes to transition to the new, Smill and Grubler are saying decades to centuries, and if you're looking about how long it takes out to phase out of the old, Turnheim and Heels are also talking about centuries. But, don't nod yet, but there is evidence now of more recent transitions that are much faster. And here in this article, we took 5 transitions at the top, which are transitions in energy end-use devices. So energy-efficient lights, improved cook stoves, LPG stoves, flex fuel vehicles. Those are vehicles that can run on ethanol or gasoline. I guess we could add hybrid electric vehicles as another example, probably. And then air conditioning. And then we took 5 transitions in energy supply, many in Europe, the Dutch dash for gas, French nuclear energy, CHP in Denmark, and then the phase out of coal in Ontario. And what's really cool is look how fast these transitions jumped from 1 to that 25% share, which was Smill's number. Although Smill was talking globally as a threshold, these are national thresholds, but still 25% is nothing small. And you can see the slowest transition here was 16 years. And some of those really fast ones, for those in the back that can't see, Brazil's flex fuel vehicle transition was 1 year, and Kuwaiti crude oil and electricity was 2 years, and LPG stoves and Denmark CHP was 3 years at the height of those transition speeds. And then, if you look at these numbers on the right, it shows you the size of the population affected. We're not talking, Smill said, impossible to accelerate in large economies. We have represented in this sample almost 1 billion people, and some of the biggest economies in the world. China, Indonesia, the United States, and some of the biggest European economies as well, France and the Netherlands, as well as Canada. So again, we're kind of really starting to challenge Smill's thinking that you cannot do it, it is impossible. And part of that, I think, if you talk to Florian and Carolina, they're kind of talking about taking a step back. What are some of the underlying drivers of transitions now that didn't exist in the 50s or 60s or 90s? And they've identified three. The first one is that kind of previous transitions were either unplanned or by accident. Abundant resource discovery, North Sea oil and gas, right? Or crisis, we have to respond, OPEC oil embargo. Whereas now, we can actively plan a transition. We know we need to do it. We can even create roadmaps, decarbonization plans, just transition plans, and so forth. Secondly, innovation dynamics can now agglomerate or speed up in very neat spatial ways that even can backfire for countries, but are also good for the global energy transition. And the example they give is the German feed-in tariff was actually supposed to spur German industrial strategy, but it backfired and actually motivated China to create huge manufacturing, and then Malaysia and others to do thin film solar photovoltaic manufacturing. So the innovation dynamics exceeded our anticipations for how fast you could scale solar, but that wasn't the intent of Germany's industrial strategy. So again, the unpredictable changes can actually accelerate these transitions. And then they had a lot of hope for Paris and the Paris Accord. And I still have some hope, given that I think other than Syria, the United States, and a few other countries, there's more than 180 countries that have committed to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, that have their NDCs, and so forth. So these three things, we can govern now, we can create unexpected spatial dynamics, and we have a global commitment to net zero that most countries are taking seriously, they think is changing the game. And they've also pointed now to new tools that we have. We don't have only tools that phase in and incentivize, we have phase out tools, like moratoriums, changing the market rules, reducing support for targeted sectors, or ensuring more debates and referendums. And I'll just give you two examples. Bans on cars at the city or national level. This is already out of date. This is like 4 years ago, and you can already see all of the places, including Norway, but also places like the UK and Paris and California and British Columbia, Mexico City, Athens, London, Cape Town, Heidelberg, Brussels, and Beijing, which are putting real restrictions on conventional cars, or fossil fuel heating. Right, The Hague has banned fossil fuel-related ads, and you can see on the right regulations that are trying to phase out of oil and gas boilers, especially in places like the United Kingdom, where I think 89% of homes still have a gas boiler, and 85% of homes do not have a programmable thermostat, so those boilers are just on all the time, around the clock. Lastly, almost done, Christian, I wanted to take a step back and think more about what these transition dynamics might mean for a project like NoTrap or NotRap. I'm still figuring out which one to use. And I want to give you 4 examples about how these transitions really are an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary challenge. The first one is called cook stoves. And I'm still amazed that it's 2025 and we still have almost 1 billion women and children around the world that cook with the same technology that Jesus Christ cooked with, open fires or very unsophisticated cooking stoves, which makes, because of indoor air pollution, cooking one of the most dangerous things a person can do in the global south. And you can see on the right data from the World Health Organization that quantifies indoor air pollution deaths. 4 million deaths a year related to indoor air pollution. And this isn't like 85-year-olds who die at the age of 80. 70% of those deaths are in young women and children under the age of 5. So this is a huge health crisis. We have to change how people cook in the global south. And this is a great example of where we really need deeply interdisciplinary research. We need, on the left, all of the fuel science people to tell us about what types of fuels should we burn and combust, and how much methane is being released, how much particulate matter, what about LPG versus kerosene, or ethanol versus plant oil, or charcoal versus dung. So it's kind of the thermodynamic science of combustion. And there actually are fuel science conferences where they will discuss the BTU attributes, or the radiative attributes of different fuels. So we have to change the fuel used in cooking. But we also have to work with those who are in architecture and design to change the built environment, right? What about hoods and vents? What about windows? Where do we place the kitchen? How tall is the kitchen, right? So it's kind of like, how do we create different infrastructure in the home? And lastly, user behavior. Someone just said they study user practices, right? How do we dry food? How do we cook? When do we cook? How long do we cook, et cetera? And the argument is that to create a truly effective cook stove intervention, you can't just do one of the three, you do all of the three. You've got to have the fuel science experts working with the designers and the built environment experts working with the behavioral scientists, the sociologists, and the anthropologists. This is just one example. I have four. That's just the first example. The second example is this is a simplified diagram of energy consumption in the home using what they call the three-dimensional energy profile. So they try to create a framework for understanding how a modern home, so this is no longer cook stoves, this is like a residential flat in Canada, uses energy. And you can see here, look how many dimensions there are. There are some personal dimensions about behavior and routines and habits and practices and experiences. There's the notion of capabilities and things that can unlock new practices, education, income, information. There's things on the left, like policies and regulations from the top down, prices and specifications and standards. And then there's also attitudes about your own behavior and what type of personality you are, extrovert, introvert, you're environmentally conscious, you're biospheric, altruistic, egocentric, or not. And all of that, look at the arrows, all of those things co-create and will co-shape an individual household or person's energy consumption dynamics. And as we may guess, to understand habits, capabilities, policies, standards, attitudes, contexts, and technology requires about 10 to 20 disciplines. So it's another example of where we absolutely need many, many voices in a single project to understand something as simple as, say, electricity consumption or heat consumption. The third is from my colleague Felix Kreutzig, who wrote this wonderful article in Nature Climate Change about demand-side solutions for climate mitigation. Felix then went on to be the coordinating lead author for the IPCC's report, Chapter 5 on energy demand, where he's arguing that we could see a 50 to 70% reduction in demand by mid-century with no loss on amenity. And he's created this framework called Avoid, Shift, Improve, where the argument is that you don't only want to focus on phasing out of unwanted practices, like cars and eating meat. You don't only want to focus on shifting behavior. You also want to focus on improving technology. And to decarbonize any particular region, you've got to focus on transport and buildings and manufacturing and industry and clothing and food. So again, think of the call for interdisciplinarity. We need food science, meets industrial strategy and political economy, meets the built environment, meets mobility services, and the kind of understanding transport nodes, and even things like mobilities, which is one of the terms now that people like sociologist John Urry uses. So again, a call for interdisciplinarity. And then lastly, and this is getting a little closer to Christian's diagram for NoTrap, is understanding the multi-scalar, polycentric, temporal dynamics of transitions. And this is Frank Hill's multi-level perspective, the MLP. It's usually drawn with the landscape on top, but for whatever reason, science thought they should put it on the bottom. And you can see here, there's even more complex diagrams, by the way. But in this diagram, the kind of notion is that these transitions co-evolve, so that you have a new niche innovation that's kind of entering in, a heat pump, a fuel cell, an e-bike, but it has to compete with other niche innovations. Battery electric cars, biofuel, algal fuel, or vertical access wind turbines, or high altitude wind turbines, or extraterrestrial solar energy, some really wacky innovations that compete. And this also has to kind of configure with the existing regime, whether it is a petrostate like Norway, right, or a coal-based state kind of like China, or even say maybe a renewable state like Ecuador, or things like that. Ecuador is a bad example. I'll go with Peru or Chile. And the argument is that these transitions are also temporal. They go through phases. You have startup, acceleration, stabilization, and then destabilization. And you create these unique windows of opportunity, which create intervention points. And understanding this, for Frank, means we have to have the innovation scholars who are understanding technological diffusion. We have to have the business scholars who are understanding finance and business models. We have to have the psychologists understand behavior. We have to have all of these people with expertise in industry, culture, political science, users, and technology rollout. And then we also have to have people like demographers, historians, and economists. So again, it's a real multidisciplinary call for I think every discipline, right? And so again, to understand these types of transitions and their multidimensionality, you cannot rely on a single discipline in isolation. So to conclude, going back to the start, right, definitions abound. Whether a transition can occur fastly or slowly does depend upon the scale. It also depends upon the unit of analysis. Is it electricity or energy? Total primary supply, total final energy consumption. Is the diffusion rate 25% for SMIL, 50% for Grubler and Wilson, 10%? Right? All of those will depend upon the assumptions of whatever you're trying to decouple. We have no shortage of frameworks. I've presented Grubler and SMILs. I didn't want to bog you down. I have another paper that has 96 theories on transitions, where we interviewed some of the theorists. But I think that we need these more multidisciplinary approaches, and remember the examples I gave of cook stoves and household energy use and policy mixes to promote climate mitigation, and how we understand multi-level transitions that are multiscalar. The causes of historical transitions are complex, right? The ones that I showed that were rapid did have a variety of causes. World War II helped motivate the French nuclear rollout. Charles de Gaulle wanted France to be radiant again. And the fact that conflict and hostilities ended in the Middle East meant that Kuwait could actually go out and build oil and gas infrastructure that wasn't under attack from the Nazis. There was a really bad rural famine behind the Chinese cook stoves rollout, and the OPEC oil crisis was really the catalyst for Denmark's combined heat and power program and for Brazil's pro-alcohol program in 1974, which was a precursor to the flex fuel one. Only one of these transitions was demand-driven, which was air conditioning. You could take a step back then and say history does suggest that the only way to create rapid transitions is world wars, famines, and crises, which is a bit depressing. It's also a very reactionary assessment. Hopefully, future transitions could be driven by different things. New governance tools, phase-outs, carbon border adjustment mechanisms, differentiated strike prices. Maybe they're driven by scarcity rather than abundance. Maybe they're driven by changes in demand rather than changes in supply. And maybe they have unforeseen pressures like Ukraine-Russia conflict or the COVID-19 pandemic. And lastly, while I admit Grubler and Wilson and SMIL have ample grounds to argue that the historical record may not bode well for transitions, I think that history here is instructive, but not necessarily predictive. Thank you.
Thank you.